It was just another ordinary day for billionaire businessman Henry Lawson. The sun had risen early that morning, casting long golden shadows across his opulent estate, where everything seemed perfect. With his morning coffee in hand, he settled into his favorite leather chair, overlooking the sprawling gardens he meticulously cultivated over the years. Despite his wealth, Henry's life felt somewhat empty. His career had been everything to him, but now, in the twilight of his life, he longed for something deeper, something that could fill the void he hadn't realized existed until it was too late. What Henry didn't know was that today, the very thing he'd been searching for, family, was about to appear in the most unexpected way. His assistant, Emily Harper, had been working for him for the past 5 years. Emily was efficient, dedicated, and had always been loyal to Henry in ways no one else ever had. She wasn't just an employee. She was someone who took care of the smallest details of his life, from managing his schedule to ensuring that he never had to lift a finger. She was young, ambitious, and sharp, with a work ethic that stood out in a world full of complacency. But there was something about Emily that Henry could never quite figure out. There was an undeniable spark in her eyes, a mix of determination and something else he couldn't put his finger on. It wasn't until that fateful day, the day everything changed, that Henry realized just how connected they were. It wasn't a connection forged by work, trust, or even friendship. No, this was something much more profound, something that would change their lives forever. The discovery was nothing short of a bombshell. Henry was sitting in his office when he received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was from an old family lawyer, one who had represented Henry's family for decades. The lawyer's words were simple, yet they held a weight that instantly made Henry's heart skip a beat. "Mr. Lawson, I have some information that may be of great importance to you. I believe Emily Harper, your assistant, is your granddaughter." For a moment, Henry was frozen. His mind raced to piece together what he had just heard. Could this really be true? His granddaughter? But how could that be? He had no idea where Emily had come from, or even much about her background. All he knew was that she had arrived at his office one day, answering an ad for a personal assistant, and had swiftly worked her way into his life, bringing order to the chaos that had been his world. Henry hadn't thought much about his family in years. His children had long moved away, each leading their own lives far from the mansion that had once been a home full of laughter and love. A tragedy years ago had left him alone, save for a few distant relatives he barely kept in touch with. Yet now, here was Emily, someone he trusted implicitly, someone who knew his every move, his every need, being called his granddaughter. As Henry tried to wrap his mind around the revelation, Emily entered his office, her usual smile lighting up the room. She was unaware of the bombshell that had just been dropped. She handed him a stack of papers, as she always did, and he looked up at her, searching her face for some sign, some hint that would explain the connection he now wondered about. "Emily," he started, his voice more cautious than usual. "Do you know anything about your family? About your past?" The question took her by surprise. She hesitated for a moment, clearly caught off guard. I don't know much. My parents died when I was young, and I was raised in foster care. I don't have much family left, just a few distant relatives, but I lost touch with them years ago." Henry's heart raced. This was the moment he had to confront the truth, and yet he couldn't quite bring himself to say it. Could it be possible? Was there a deeper reason why Emily had come into his life, as though fate had intervened to bring them together after all these years? As the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, Henry struggled with his emotions. There were so many questions swirling in his mind. How had Emily come to him? Why had fate allowed them to cross paths at this moment in time? And what did all of this mean for the future of his legacy? But just as Henry was about to speak, there was a sudden knock on the door. It was the lawyer again, and this time he had something more than just words. He had documents, legal papers that could change everything. "Mr. Lawson," he said solemnly, "I have proof. Proof that Emily Harper is indeed your granddaughter." Henry's pulse quickened. The evidence was irrefutable, but even more shocking was the revelation that his late son, who had disappeared years ago, had left behind a hidden family secret. Emily was the result of a long-forgotten love affair, one that no one in the family had ever spoken of. The weight of the truth began to settle in, and with it, 1,000 questions flooded Henry's mind. How could he have missed all the signs? How could he have spent all these years without realizing that the family he thought was lost was standing right in front of him? Emily, his granddaughter, had been working for him all this time, unknowingly connected to the very legacy he had spent a lifetime building. But there was more to this story than just the shock of a family reunion. Emily's past, her struggles, and the secrets that had been buried for years were slowly starting to unravel. Henry realized that discovering the truth about her was just the beginning. What he didn't know was that Emily's return would set in motion a series of events that would forever change their lives and reveal a dark secret that would challenge everything Henry thought he knew about his family. As the lawyer handed Henry the final document, Emily watched silently, unaware of the storm that was brewing around her. The clock was ticking, and the answers they were about to uncover would set them on a journey neither of them could have ever imagined. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And as Henry sat back in his chair, the truth sinking in, he realized that the one thing he'd been missing all these years had found its way into his life, not through wealth, power, or success, but through the discovery of family. His long-lost granddaughter, the one person he never expected to find, had been right in front of him the entire time. But just as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, another question lingered in the air, unanswered. What was Emily's role in his family's legacy? Could she help him unlock the mysteries of his past? Or was there a darker force at play, one that threatened to destroy everything he had worked so hard to build? The answers lay just beyond the horizon. And as Henry and Emily prepared to uncover the truth, the story was only just beginning. As Henry sat in his office, the weight of the documents in his hands felt like an anchor pulling him deeper into a sea of uncertainty. The lawyer, a calm and collected man, had left the room after presenting the paperwork, but Henry couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of disbelief. His granddaughter, Emily. The realization was both thrilling and unsettling. He had spent years in solitude, isolated by the loss of his family, and now here was someone he had come to rely on, who was, by blood, a part of him. Emily, sitting across from him, looked at him with those curious, soft eyes. She was still in the dark, unaware of the bombshell that had just been dropped. He didn't know how to tell her. How could he? Would she even believe it? What would she think of him, a stranger in her life, suddenly telling her she was his granddaughter? The silence in the room grew thick, suffocating. Henry stood up abruptly, pacing the length of his office. His mind swirled with thoughts of his son, Charles, Emily's father. He hadn't seen Charles in over a decade. Not since that fateful day when the young man had left, broken-hearted after the tragic death of his wife. At the time, Henry had thought he'd lost his son forever. Little did he know, Charles had been carrying a secret that would resurface now, with the sudden return of his daughter. The more Henry thought about it, the more questions arose. How had Charles kept this secret from him all those years? Was Emily aware of her true heritage? Could she possibly know the truth? And what did this mean for his company, his legacy, his entire life? Emily had been a part of his world for 5 years, and during that time, Henry had come to rely on her in ways he couldn't explain. She had grown from an assistant into someone he trusted completely, someone he had even considered a friend. But now everything had changed. Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, soft and hesitant. "Mr. Lawson, is everything okay?" She looked at him, sensing his unease. "You've been so quiet. Did I do something wrong?" Henry stopped pacing, and for the first time, he really looked at her. She was so much like Charles in her demeanor. The same intense focus, the same drive, the same spark of ambition. But there was also something in her eyes that reminded him of his late wife, a softness that melted his heart. She was family, after all, his flesh and blood. And yet, here they were, strangers to one another, bound together by blood and circumstance, but separated by years of silence. "Emily," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "There's something you need to know. Something about your past, about your family." She looked at him, puzzled, as if trying to anticipate where this conversation might go. "What do you mean?" Henry hesitated. He couldn't just blurt out the truth. She deserved more than that. He had to be careful, to find a way to break the news without overwhelming her. But the truth was already out there, lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. "It's about your father, Charles." At the mention of her father, Emily's eyes softened. I don't know much about him," she said quietly. "I was so young when he passed away. I barely remember him." Henry nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the years that had passed since Charles had walked out of his life. The pain of losing his son had been unbearable, but the pain of not knowing had been worse. He had never gotten the chance to ask Charles about Emily, never had the opportunity to understand the secret that had torn his family apart. "You see," Henry continued, "Charles didn't just leave. He left with a secret that would change everything if it were ever discovered." Emily leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. "A secret?" Henry's voice dropped to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might hear him. Emily, you're my granddaughter. Your father, Charles, was my son. And when he left all those years ago, he took you with him. He kept you hidden from me, from the world." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Emily's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching for the edge of the desk, as if she needed something to steady herself. "What are you saying? This can't be true." Henry's heart broke as he watched her struggle to comprehend the impossible. "It's true, Emily. You are my granddaughter. You were born to Charles and his wife, who died when you were just a baby. And all these years, you've been right here, working by my side, and I had no idea." Emily's mind was racing, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She had always wondered about her family, about where she had come from, but she had never imagined that the answers would be this shocking. "But why didn't anyone tell me? Why wasn't I told about my family?" Her voice cracked, the hurt and confusion evident. Henry felt his own guilt wash over him. He had been too wrapped up in his own grief to see what was right in front of him. "Your father, he left. He cut all ties with me after your mother's death. He never told me about you. I didn't know you existed until now." As the truth sank in, the room seemed to close in around them. The air felt charged, filled with unresolved tension and unanswered questions. But there was something else, something darker, that was beginning to emerge. Henry had learned that Emily wasn't just a lost granddaughter. There were deeper secrets buried beneath the surface. Secrets that, once uncovered, would shake their family to its very core. Henry could feel the storm brewing on the horizon, a storm he wasn't sure he was ready for. The more he dug into his family's past, the more tangled the web seemed to become. What other secrets had Charles kept hidden? What had happened all those years ago that had caused the rift between father and son? And what part did Emily play in all of this? As the questions piled up, Henry realized that the answers wouldn't come easily. And worse, the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. There were people who would stop at nothing to protect the family's darkest secrets, and Henry had just opened a door that could never be closed again. The tension between them thickened, but it was interrupted by a knock on the door. Henry glanced up, his pulse quickening. Who could it be now? The lawyer? Another family member? Someone who knew more than they were letting on. With a deep breath, he motioned for Emily to stay seated. The door opened slowly, revealing a figure from Henry's past, someone he never thought he'd see again. The door creaked open, and Henry's heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway was a face he hadn't seen in years, a face he had never wanted to see again. It was Michael Lawson, his estranged brother. Michael had been the black sheep of the family, a man whose ambition and greed had led him down a dark path. Henry had long since severed ties with him after a bitter falling out over the family business. The man who once sat at the head of the company's board had turned out to be more interested in power than family. The last time Henry had heard from Michael, the man had disappeared, his whereabouts unknown. But here he was, standing in front of them, looking just as cold and calculating as Henry remembered. Michael's eyes swept over Henry, then landed on Emily. A smile, too sharp, too knowing, twisted his lips. "Well, well, well," Michael said, his voice dripping with something that felt like triumph. "So the truth has come out, has it?" Henry stood frozen, unable to speak. His mind raced. What was Michael doing here? Had he known about Emily? Had he been involved in the secret that had torn their family apart? "How much do you think you know, Henry?" Michael continued, stepping into the room, his presence as imposing as ever. "You've been living in a fairy tale, thinking your son and his family were gone forever. But you couldn't have been more wrong." Emily looked back and forth between the two men, confused, unsure of what was happening. She had always thought Henry's family was straightforward, but now everything seemed to be unraveling in front of her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael's smile grew wider, though it never reached his eyes. "I'm Michael Lawson, the man who made sure your father's secret stayed buried. And now it's time for you to know the rest of the story, Emily." Henry's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about, Michael?" Michael glanced at his brother with disdain. "You always were the naive one, Henry. Your son Charles didn't just disappear. He didn't leave to find himself. No, he was running from something, a mistake he made that cost him everything. But I made sure to cover it up, to protect our family's reputation. That's why Charles kept Emily a secret, why he never told you about her. Because he couldn't face the consequences of what he'd done." Henry's mind was spinning. "What did he do, Michael? What was so terrible that he had to hide it from me? From all of us?" Michael's expression darkened. Charles got mixed up with the wrong people. There was an affair. A woman from his past who he thought he could trust, someone who promised him everything. But she had her own agenda. When he found out what she was really after, it was too late. Emily wasn't the only thing he had to hide. The woman, the one who destroyed his life, she was after something far worse than his love. She was after the family business, Henry. She wanted everything. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the pieces began to fall into place. Her mother, her father's secrets, the mystery of her past, it was all connected to the family's legacy, to the empire that Henry had built. "But why didn't anyone tell me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Why did they let me grow up not knowing?" Michael's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. Because the truth would have destroyed you, Emily. It would have torn the family apart, exposed everything. The affair, the betrayal, the woman who tried to steal it all. Your father, he couldn't protect you from the truth. So he kept you hidden, hoping you'd never find out. Henry stood in shock, his mind a whirlwind of betrayal, loss, and guilt. He had always thought that his son's departure had been a result of grief, but now he saw the full extent of the darkness that had consumed their family. It wasn't just the loss of his daughter-in-law, it was the loss of control, of trust, of everything they had built. So what now? Henry finally found his voice, his tone hardening. What do you want, Michael? Michael stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with ambition. What I've always wanted. Power. Control. And now, with Emily in the picture, everything is mine. Your company, your legacy, everything. You've lost Henry. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. The realization hit her hard. Michael wasn't just here to stir up old wounds. He was here to take it all. The wealth, the power, the very empire Henry had spent his life building. And with her now connected to this family, Michael saw her as the key to his conquest. But Emily wasn't about to let that happen. A fire sparked in her chest, a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She turned to Henry, her eyes steady with determination. You don't need him, grandfather. You have me. Henry looked at her, a mixture of awe and pride flooding his heart. She was right. She was the key, not just to his family's legacy, but to his future. He didn't need Michael, didn't need to let the past control him. The truth had come to light, and now it was time to take control of the present. You're right, Henry said, his voice firm. You're my granddaughter, and I'll protect you, no matter what. Michael's smile faltered, replaced by a sneer of frustration. You think you can stop me, Henry? I've already won. But Emily stepped forward, standing tall. Not this time. You may have played your games in the shadows, but this is the light now. And I'm not backing down. The tension in the room was palpable, the battle lines drawn. Michael's face twisted in anger as he realized the control he thought he had was slipping away. But it was too late. Henry had made his choice, and with Emily by his side, they would face whatever came next, together. As Michael stormed out, vowing revenge, Henry and Emily stood in the silence that followed. The storm had passed, but the battle was far from over. What mattered now was the legacy they would build, not from secrets and lies, but from truth and trust. As they looked at each other, a new bond formed between them. In the end, it wasn't just the empire that mattered, it was family. And together, they would forge a future that no one could tear apart.